So, is this working? I hope so. This is a video blog, first video blog. I've done it forever. It's me, Fyree, from Nintendo Realms and Twitter and Facebook, if you know me. Just random discussion. I'm gonna talk a little bit about the era I grew up in video gaming, the 90s, which was by far the best decade in my opinion. And if you don't agree, I can understand, because it's a agree or disagree amongst a lot of people I know. But those who I know who grew up in the same time as I did in the 90s, the whole 90s decade, from the NES era to the SNES and the N64 and PlayStation and Sega and all those. But growing up, I will always remember the Sonic versus Mario rivalry. I will always remember Sega and Nintendo trying to one-up each other. I remember the ads for the Game Gear with like the the people sitting on the plane. One of them playing they're playing like a game on a TV. I think probably like a Sega or a Nintendo game on a TV. And then like somebody sitting next to them was playing a Game Gear. And then like the plane took off, and the big old long extension cord like ran out as the plane took off, and the dude couldn't play his game anymore. I remember that. I remember all of that, and all the companies that came and went during that era, all the games and series that came out and were started. I mean, you had the best of the best. All the games that we play now, if the video game war, the console wars of the 90s hadn't have gone the way they did, who knows what we would have been playing now. If Sony hadn't come out with the PlayStation, of course, Sony and Nintendo hadn't schemed up the concept of a PlayStation, which was probably a way to compete more closely with Sega's CD and then the Saturn eventually. But then Sony split up. Nintendo went to Philips, made the CDI, which was, I think if it was released today, it probably wouldn't have gotten the bad rap it did, but it did. But I mean, basically the console wars ended when the PlayStation came out, because there's nothing else that could compete, because that was the top of the line. Nintendo stayed alive, Sega stayed alive somewhat. All the smaller companies who were involved in that, I want to say from like 1990 to like 95 was the console war era, which is still the best because nobody held back. You had your Sonics, you had your Marios, but you had your Mega Mans, you had your Final Fantasies and your Ninja Gaidens and your Mortal Kombats and your Street Fighters. You had the best third-party companies making some of, if not their best products ever. You still had arcades, a lot of really good arcade games in that era, a lot of good racing games and fighting games, and the consoles had a great bunch of platformers and action games and shoot-'em-ups, and I mean, it was really the best era to live in. And a lot of people say, a lot of people compare that era to now. I'm like, sure, the Wii and the 360 and the PS3, that's a good competition. There's a good console battle there. I don't think it's a quote-unquote console war. There's no real video game war, because, I mean, I will admit it, Sony makes far superior games for the PS3 than Nintendo makes for the Wii, but then again, that's just the time we live in. That's just what Sony has, and compared to what Nintendo has. Like it was back in '95 when the PlayStation came out. Sony had what they had, and Nintendo had what they had. Sony's just, worked better and had a lot more to offer. And, Nintendo stayed alive, but then again, all the people who are pro Sony and seemingly always, bash or insult Nintendo. I'm like, well, without Nintendo's partnership with Sony in the first place for what became the PlayStation, you wouldn't be playing your PS3. You certainly wouldn't have your Move or your PS Vita. But I'm not going to get into that. I'm focusing on the positive, and the positive for me, the best era of video games in general for me of my entire lifetime, which I will look back on. I look back on now, 15 years later, and 20 years later, and I'm missing that. I'm missing the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis battling out, what came out on Sega, what came out on Nintendo, all the commercials, with Nintendo, Sega does, and so on and so forth, all the ads. And I miss that. I love today's games, don't get me wrong, but the 90s had the best games for me. The early 90s especially, till 95. I had my Sonic the Hedgehog. I had my Marios. I had my Mega Man. I had my Tetris. I had my Street Fighter. I had my Mortal Kombat. I had all my good racing games. I had every game I've ever liked, pretty much, was back in that era, or is a result of that era. I mean, I wouldn't be playing Mario Bros. Wii without the success of the original Marios, and the only reason the Mario game succeeded, a lot of the reason, is because they weren't holding back. Nintendo was releasing the games that they knew would compete the best, and they did. And if you had to choose a victor between Sega and Nintendo, it would be Nintendo. Because, well, Sega may have at one point probably been, better than Nintendo in a lot of aspects. Nintendo won. And when all was said and done, Sega bottomed out. Because 4 years after the PlayStation came out, the Dreamcast came out for Sega, and maybe not even 2 years later, that was pretty much a dead console because it came out too soon. And Sega never got back into it, so they basically were like the ultimate, I don't want to say the word, but they were really like the ultimate loser of the video game war, the console wars, because where are they now? They're a third-party developer making games for other systems without their own console to make their own games for and have a backup third-party library. Nintendo's still making games. Say what you will about the 3DS and the upcoming Wii U, but at least Nintendo is still making their own games, and despite the lack of third-party support for their consoles, all they need is Mario and Pokemon and the other mainstay franchises that have lasted them for 20-some-odd years. Just a few thoughts. I'd appreciate comments. If you want to discuss this, post comments or find me on Twitter.com or Facebook or Nintendo Realm. Later. Work.